Yours looks like it's looking down at about here. I don't know why. So, looking at SPQR, and I've been playing this over, I don't know, maybe the past 6 months or so, maybe a little less than that. And, I mean, I wouldn't have played as many scenarios of it and kind of feel this commitment to keep playing if I didn't enjoy it. So you know right away, wow, I've been seeing a lot of these. Obviously, there's a certain enjoyment. I'm going to try to focus on, because I went over a rules overview in one of the scenarios, and you can look back, especially if you're on the Geek, to see about that. This game, it's hard for me to talk about it straight up, because, first of all, I received the old version of the game, and I bought it used, and I also got a lot of the, I guess 4 of the expansions for it, and then all of the magazine stuff. I'm assuming much of that comes in the Designer's Edition, which would be the route that I would suggest taking unless you get a deal on something like this. The reason there is, this older version, first of all, it comes with, if you collect up everything, most of those scenarios are going to be in your Designer's Edition anyway. And I'm assuming there may be some little rules tweaks between the editions, just to clean things up a little bit, as well as maybe some improvements on the graphics on the counters. I've had problems with kind of the mixture of color in some of the scenarios or something. That may not be avoidable. But you get a lot of crap here, all told. You get, tray after tray of counters. Just, it's not like, you don't have sort of generic units, which one would almost expect on something like this. There's a lot of units with the same values that are just different by color, or maybe a little bit off on values. With everything that I've got, you've got tons and tons of different leaders. Basically, every scenario has its own leader, or a couple of major leaders for each side, and other than a few generic leaders that are reused again and again, like the Roman proconsuls or the Carthaginian lesser generals, you pretty much have at least 1 or 2 leaders per side that are for every scenario, and there are a lot of scenarios. This is just the I haven't played yet list, as opposed to the dozen or whatever that I've played. I have no idea. I haven't been counting. You get a lot of different games, a lot of different situations, a chance to play out a lot of different tactical systems against each other, and of course, you can do what-if type scenarios. For example, there's a published one for what if Alexander the Great went into Italy and attacked Rome at that time. And you could, of course, play with your own and fiddle around and say, well, what if the Carthaginians were trying to suppress the Maccabees? So you have that ability to look at a lot of different military systems, formations, etc., and see how they interact, even ones that didn't necessarily fight one another. And that's all really, really interesting to me. The complaints one might have against this game, now I really like it, so for me they're not really complaints, they're part of what I like about it. One is, here's one that I dislike. I dislike hunting through all the counters to find what I need for a scenario. I find that in other series, like the Musket and Pike series, it's very helpful to have the scenario in a bag. Each scenario has its own counters. Here, in order to reduce what would be an incredible cost if you include the C3I magazine expansions and stuff like that, there's somewhat more generic counters. One particular, Cretans are used throughout several different scenarios. The Roman legions are used through several different scenarios. In some cases, like with the Romans, it's not very hard at all. You just as long as you have them sorted in a bag or something, it's not difficult to find what you need. But the sorting requirements to keep all those scenarios together or to keep the pieces together are tricky to say the least. For me, I've got them sorted out into counter trays for the most part at this point. Just saying, I'm going to be playing enough of these over the next year or whatever it takes me to get through this remaining list. Because I'm not going to play straight through. I'm going to be doing things in between. That it's worth keeping them in a counter tray. The same way I used to be with SFB. I'd play it enough that I'd want it always sorted. Well, I feel that way with this, at least until I've played every scenario at least once. But some other things that people have, I could definitely see an objection to. First off, let's just take a look at, there's a complaint about, that people often arise about fiddly games. This is about, let's take the battles of the Age of Reason and probably Labatt as well out of the picture here, because I think they're the only things that beat this. But this is one of the fiddliest of games in that sense. You're constantly moving counters and flipping them over to indicate that you've moved them, and then at the end of the turn you got to unflip everything, and you've got to do a lot of bookkeeping with counters, etc. A lot of that gets cleared away with the simplified Great Battles of History. I haven't played it, I've looked at the rules though. It feels to me to be of the same flavor using that as, say, Men of Iron is, which is a very, very much lighter on the back, on the playing, in terms of how much effort you have to put in to actually make your pieces do what you want them to do. On the other hand, I kind of like the mechanical aspects of the game, so I've kind of stayed away from that. In fact, my feeling always with the Men of Iron and Infidel was, damn, wouldn't this be great if they were actually Great Battles of History instead? I want the amount of detail that this game provides, and if you also want that, you might want to stay away from the simplified and actually go for this. If you just want the flavor and the feel and the results, sort of, well, I think the simplified is, from what I've heard, now I haven't played it, but from what I've heard, it gives you more or less the correct results. It gives you the feel, no question. I mean, I had the feel just as much in the Men of Iron games as I do here. There's a little bit of weirdness with not having this full imposition of the turn order anymore in the game. But when you're getting rid of all that counter flipping, and I think even the cohesion hits go away in it, if I remember correctly, you just have gotten rid of so many aspects of the game that are expensive mechanically. On the other hand, there's some of the story lost with the mechanics being lost, but it's going to be faster playing, so the story gets to you more without any barriers or anything. That's one big one, and I would say if you are of the type who doesn't like a fiddly type of game, I would aim more for get one that's supported by simplified Great Battles and play that first. And don't go big on the system, because some of the battles, some of the boxed games, as I understand, aren't really supported by simplified. Another option is Samurai, which is a little lighter, but still you're putting a lot of pieces on the board and moving and flipping counters and stuff in ways that just doesn't feel good to a lot of people. Then there's another aspect, which is the ancient battles themselves. First of all, a lot of these battles are not balanced, and you just have to know that when you're walking into it. The battles in many system games, there's often one or two that are just such key battles of the era that they had to be put in, but they don't tend to be balanced. But in these, most of these battles actually and this is true with the Men of Iron series as well, most of these battles ended up as blowouts. And that's just a fact of life of this pre-gunpowder era. Just because of the power that the cavalry had, there's no way to lay down a defensive fire that's effective enough to cover a retreat. So what you really have is, once an army breaks, it's, doomed. And some of these battles are very, very much not just were they blowouts, but they were never close to begin with. Something like Cannae. Look, if you play that with any of the historical, feel for Varro, you're just not going to succeed with it. And because you have these leader counters and they affect things heavily, you might want to tweak this scenario and say, hey, what if Scipio was in charge instead, the older Scipio, Publius? What if he was in charge instead? Would it be different? And those are interesting little what-ifs that you can play around if you're willing to tweak and play with the system. But a lot of the scenarios you have, a lot of the great battles that you know from history, they just aren't going to be things that you want to play in a competitive environment at all. You may want to switch sides and play both ways and see who wins by the most or something along those lines. But there's also something in the very nature of an ancient battle. And I would say to some extent this kind of fits in with Civil War battles as well, although they're very popular. And Romans may be popular and Greeks may be popular, but a lot of the great battles of history series may not be quite as popular. Where the popularity comes is more from the flavor and the feel of the era, rather than the decision making you're going to get to make in this. Certainly, once you learn the mechanics of how to do things properly, not just within the rules, but how to do things properly, how to handle your troops in a way that's consistent with what was actually done, how to use the rules system that the designer provided in the way that he meant it to be used, you've gone a very long way. And that's the big thing that you're going to gain here. It's not like you're going to sit here and think, what if I do this massive outflank or something? Most of these battles start out with the troops almost touching. They're close enough, there's just not a lot of room for maneuver in them. And you're just trying to maximize how well you handle those troops. And that's a situation that doesn't allow for a lot of big decisions. What it really allows for is the more practiced you are with handling them, the more of the little rules that you're familiar with using correctly, for example. And I'm horrible at this, obviously, because I can't keep the rules straight. I put the game away for a couple months, I come back, and I don't know what I'm doing anymore. I really have to work towards that. There's a lot of rules here, and it's a situation where, unless you're playing it fairly regularly, like I was before, and maybe I will soon, following this up, I may be playing enough of them that I'll be still in touch with the rules enough that I won't screw up as much. But even when I was used to it, there'd be little special rules for scenarios or something you haven't seen in a while that you had to look up, and you may not completely get it right. And is that terrible? No. But you're not going to be handling your troops in the sort of optimal manner mechanically that you need to provide what the game is really designed to show. And what the game really shows is how these tactical systems interact. And I think that's what you want to be able to see when you're walking into it, is not so much, can I beat my opponent? That can be fun or whatever, but how does this actually work? What is the designer's intent behind this rule? What are they trying to show? And maybe lead you back to your history to look at why maybe this is designed in quite this way. Why is it that units are locked into these rigid zone of controls in the way that they are? And what are the special exemptions to that seem to be in there. The rules themselves are kind of a mixed bag. Again, I'm using an older version, the second edition upgrade for the rules. They seem clear enough, but it's a pretty common GMT situation where the structure's not really imposed on them in the same way, and I feel like it's very easy to lose rules in that case. And especially because of all the special cases, because of all the... I'm not using elephants in this scenario, I'll just pass that by. That you don't get a full feel for the whole system, and I'm sure this happens with a lot of different games. But then, when you do just read that rule in isolation, say elephants because you need them, or you're worried about the skirmishers and you want to understand, hey, can I, flood, can I really do harassing fire? And it turns out you can. Whether or not the scenarios are set up to allow it to work in the way that you'd hope it would is kind of hard. So in this last scenario that I played, I think I could have used the Carthaginian slingers to move forward, do some more harassing fire than they did, and try to buy a little bit more time. Not so much in the center, though. There just wasn't room there. So that's kind of there's these rules that sometimes will come into effect and you can use them, or maybe you've just put them out of your mind because you want to get the basic core of the system, and then you never really learn them. And it is such a rich and deep game with so much coverage of so many different little pieces and so many special mechanisms that you really, without playing a lot of the games of it, I don't know, if you're like me, you're not going to get a good... excuse me, a good grasp of how to handle your units in just a mechanically sound fashion. Make them do things that you want them to do. So again, in this last scenario, I tried to swing my phalanx out and, take opportunity outflanks on the Romans with them. Well, that's not the way to do it, it seems. They got decimated trying to do that. They're fine if they stand in a line and they can actually fight the Romans coming at them if they're defending. But in order to use them as an offensive hammer, the way that a Cannae or in this you'd want to do, you kind of have to pivot that whole line, get it into place, and then move it forward. And that's a painful and slow exercise. I'm not sure I have the patience to always do it. In this case, I didn't even really think along those lines. I thought, I've got some, really opportune attacks to make, and I'll just do them. Well, that's really dangerous in this. It's something you can get away with maybe in a Civil War game, because you're going to break the opponent's line, and what's the worst he does is maybe comes back and breaks your front line, and then his reserves have been committed, and now you can break his reserve line. Well, and this doesn't feel like that really works. There are units that are just so much more important than others, like the phalanxes. In a Civil War type game, everything's pretty much the same. Compared to something like musket and pike, yeah, you have the same delicacy of units where you have different ones that have different functions. I don't feel like there's the same amount of variance, though, as there is in these ancient games. And I don't feel like it's there in the Men of Iron either. There's just so many different little types, and if you're not optimizing how to use them in the correct way and how to support them with your other units, you probably... See, these are almost doctrinal things of their time period. I mean, the Roman army didn't go out and do really weird stuff. And it's not prohibited in the rules from exposing your flanks or making these weird marches or whatever. And at times you do want to, like once you've got the enemy out of your way, if you're hitting them with the final blow, you might as well take these risks because you're going to finish them off here and you want to do it as quickly as possible. But it's not obvious from the get-go. And usually not for me without making the same mistake a few times, how to keep your troops in that correct order and how to bring them forward correctly to do what you want to do without violating sort of the doctrine of the day. I don't know about the player's guide. That may give a lot of that kind of information. It's kind of enjoyable to discover it on your own, though. You know, I really got a kick out of watching that Carthaginian phalanx just disappear. You know, because it tried to break order. It's potent when it breaks order, just because it can get those flank attacks and whatever, but it doesn't have the flexibility to do that and survive. And we saw that. It just disappeared. You know, the Romans hit it from every which angle. Units are running, and then the next line comes charging up and hits. It's too thin, it's too brittle. And there's a reason that the phalanx disappeared in the face of those Roman armies. The countries which could afford to put them out there couldn't. They had it proven to them that it wasn't effective, and other countries that maybe were further behind, in terms of softer technologies in the military side, formation, training, etc., just weren't advanced enough to put something like that out there. It's an interesting period to look at, because this is really the death of the phalanx period that this game covers. Now, I've got a bunch of other great battles of history. Playing Samurai, looking at components for this and a couple of the others, I was sold on the system and went big on it. And I'm glad I did. I think I have enjoyed all of them. The one that I'm not so sure I'm going to like is Lion of the North, but I had to pick it up. I got it cheap, missing a component, one piece. But I knew that ahead of time. But I got it cheap enough that, I said, well, it will be interesting to see how this system handles the wars of Gustavus as compared to musket and pike, which is really designed towards them. So it seemed like a cool idea there. I really want to get to the more ancient ones, the chariots, and maybe the Indian stuff with lots and lots of elephants. See how those play out. There's just so many different entries into this system, so many different periods that are being looked at. It's going to be interesting to see how much of the system carries over. I know in Samurai, a lot of the system from SPQR and Alexander, which is very similar, was very different. It changed very much in that incarnation. And so, to some extent, they're all similar, maybe similar mechanics to how you get initiative or whatever. But there's a lot of differences to how they actually play out. In fact, just one of the scenarios I played recently, Raphael, had a totally different structure for who commands what in the army. One that felt more like Samurai or Men of Iron, where you had specific commands. There's a lot of tinkering and tweaking in the scenarios to make them fit exactly what you expect, which is cool. I mean, somebody's put the effort in to say, no, this is what should happen here, and I like that. Anyway, I think it's a good game. I think it's a very good game system. It's something that I've wanted for a long time, in terms of I wanted something that would cover the pre-gunpowder period in good detail. I kind of enjoyed some of the old SPI offerings, and I have Agincourt and should be hitting that at some point. But this system and its sort of little brother, Men of Iron, really impressed me in terms of giving me this feel for what's happening, being able to watch it happen, and feel like it works right. When you get the mechanics down, you really do say, now I see how that's supposed to work. But if you don't really know the period, and even if, whether you know it or not, if you don't understand how the rules are implementing it, it can be a little bewildering at times. And in some cases, it's just going to be bewildering. Like in a big Cav battle, the Cav end up swirling around in confusion, and I think you just have to kind of accept that. That's something that affects this. It affects Men of Iron, and it affects the Musket and Pike series, where the Cav are just kind of so chaotic compared to everything else. The infantry in these games is all very stately, and maybe not the skirmishers, but especially things like the phalanxes and the big units. They move very slowly forward. They can't do anything too tricky. Anyway, good game. I hope you get something out of this one. I don't know.